Hey, what's up everybody? In this video, I'll be taking you through some of the exciting new features coming to Tailwind CSS in the version 2.2 release. Let's get right into it. Okay, we'll start off with the new CLI, which is now full-featured and is the quickest and fastest way to compile Tailwind CSS. So check this out. I'm starting a completely empty project here. And if I open the sidebar, you can see that we have absolutely nothing. So I'll create an index.html file here. And this is going to be a super simple scaffold. And I will just add a link tag, which is a file that doesn't exist yet, but we're going to create. I'll also come down in the body tag here and I have a h1 tag that says hello world, and has a class of text red 500. And we're going to generate this build/Tailwind CSS file now. So without installing anything, I can type npx Tailwind CSS, and I will define an output folder with -o, current folder /build/tailwind.css. So this is going to build the entire default Tailwind CSS file based on the default config, since we don't have a config. And I'll just close the terminal here. So you can see that now we have this gigantic default CSS file, which is megabytes of CSS and uses all the utilities that we've never touched or used. But check this out now. I'll bring the same command once again, but I'll add another flag --JIT for just in time. And I'll also add another flag --purge, which is going to allow me to pass the files that the JIT engine should be scanning. And here we're just going to tell it to look at */star.html. We're going to look at all the HTML file, which is just that one, and run Tailwind with the just-in-time mode, without any config file, any CSS file, literally just an index.html. So let's run that. And you can see that this time it's run much faster in 117 milliseconds. And if we look at the CSS output, it is much smaller. The vast majority is the base layer. And if I go right at the bottom, we will find here the text red 500 class, which is the only class that we have in our HTML. Okay, and now for perhaps the most useful feature of the new CLI. Once again, I will call the same command, but I will add one more flag, which is --watch, or in short, -w. And this is going to start a watch process. So when I run it, you can see that it will complete, but the process is not terminated. It still goes and it's waiting now for some changes. So if I scroll down here in my HTML and I add another class like text3xl and save, you can see that the CSS has been rebuilt in 10 milliseconds and the new class text3xl is here. And you can do all the just-in-time things here. So let's add a width with an arbitrary value of 321 pixels. And you can see that class generated here. And of course, you can always do the things that you were able to do before, and you can integrate Tailwind with all the tools that you used to. But this new CLI gives you an option to get started straight away without setting up anything. If you look, we haven't set up a package JSON file. We haven't installed any dependencies, not even a CSS file. All we have is an index.html file, which we reference in the JIT flag to tell the compiler what to scan. And we're off to the races. All right, so that was a pretty good amuse-bouche to get us started. Now, let's see what else is on the menu. To showcase the other features that I want to show you in this video, we're going to use this avocado on toast recipe piece of UI. And there's different sections that are going to help me illustrate different features that I want to show you. So you might remember that in version 2.1, we released the new just-in-time engine, which unlocks all sorts of new ideas for the framework. Tailwind version 2.2 builds on that with a ton of features that are possible thanks to this new engine. All of the features that I'm going to show you next are exclusive to the new just-in-time mode. Now we're talking. Very good. If you've lived one winter in Sydney, you know what's up. Temperatures inside houses see a lot of variations. So does Tailwind 2.2, which brings a whole lot of new variants to the table. The just-in-time compiler opened doors wide open for Tailwind CSS to support new pseudo-element variants. First letter, first line, marker, selection, first of type, last of type, default,
indeterminate, placeholder shown, autofill.
That's essentially almost all the well-supported pseudo-classes available in Tailwind now. Let's take a look at a few of them. So I'm going to come to this paragraph here, and we're going to add a few utility classes. So let's try first letter. So first letter. So let's go with text3xl. And let's do another one. First letter, text yellow 500. And let's increase the font weight as well with first letter font black. So that's looking pretty interesting. And you could also select the entire first line with first line. And let's make this whole line yellow 500. And you can see that it works. Okay, so let me remove this. And you might have noticed before when I selected the text, we have that default OS level setting, which is pink in my case for the selection. So let me scroll up to the body tag at the top. I'm going to style the selection for all the text in that page. And I'm going to go with selection. And let's go with BG yellow 200. And also selection text yellow. And we're going to go with 800 here. So now when I select any piece of text, it looks a little bit more on brand, which is a nice little touch. If I scroll down a little bit here in the UI, you can see we have our list of ingredients. And because there's a lot of repeating markup here, I've actually used Alpine.js to make a little loop and iterate over some data. And for each ingredient in this array of ingredients, I'm going to output an li item. So let's come in our classes here. And we can try to select the first one, for example, with first of type. So let's go with first of type. And here for the first element, avocados, we're going to make the background gray instead of green. BG gray 100. And you can see now our first of type is gray. And same with last of type, BG red 100. And you can see that now our olive oil, the last item, is red. And I'll show you one more. So in my list of ingredients here, let me add an empty string. So imagine that from the database, one of the elements comes and it's empty. You can see that it's still going to output a little bullet because of the internal padding. We probably want to hide it. And we can use the empty variant for this. So I'm going to go empty here. And if it is empty, hidden, you will see that this bullet is gone. Now, worth noting, the empty variant is only really empty if there's nothing, no other elements, not even an empty space. So if I add an empty space here in my array, you can see that the element is considered not empty and it's back. All right, so let's scroll down to this block quote here, and we're going to focus especially on this decorative quote mark here. Currently, it's implemented as a div element. And while there's nothing wrong with using a div like we've done here, quite often folks in situations like this would want to reach for the before pseudo-element to be able to create this decorative mark. So we're going to convert this div here and make it use the before pseudo-element instead. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to come and grab these classes here and cut them off. We don't need the rest, and delete this div entirely. So now our quote has disappeared, obviously. And I'm going to come and paste these in the block quotes. But for each class, starting with absolute, I am going to add a prefix variant of before, like so. So we've defined the before pseudo element with an absolutely position at top 0 and left 0, and a text of 8XL and text yellow 400. If we look at any of these, you can see that the content property is set to an empty string by default. So now we want to be able to define the content here, and there's a few options to do that. The first one is to come in our config file, and in theme extend, we're going to open a content object, and here we can create different content values. So I can call one quote and set this to be a set of single quotes with a quote mark inside of it. So this is going to create a content-quote utility for us. And so here now I can go before content dash and quote, here it is. And this is now going to set the content value to this, and here it is. Another way to do this is to use arbitrary values here. So instead of content dash quote, I will open a set of square brackets, and here inside quotes, once again, I can pass a string that I want to use. So I can use that quote once again, and that still work. But if I change this to wow, you can see that it's updated. Now, there's some limitations to this. For example, you cannot use spaces because a class name cannot contain spaces. So if I go, oh, space, no, you can see that now it has stopped working and we've broken things. Let me quickly go back to the code for a second. So if you need spaces, you can use the third option, which is to use an attribute dedicated for that. before the class here, I can create an attribute and I'll call it before, but it can be called anything you want. And I will here go, oh, no, actually, oh, yes. And down here in my arbitrary value, I can reference this attribute with attr and the name of the attribute, before. And now you can see, oh, yes, it works. So let's go back to our little quote here. And so the after pseudo-element works exactly the same way. And with these 3 different techniques to populate the content property, this gives you quite a bit of flexibility if you need to use before and after pseudo-elements. So Tailwind already had the concept of group variants, which allowed you to target parent elements to do things like group hover. And the peer variants work in a similar way, but for sibling elements. In other words, you can style an element when something happens to another sibling element. So we're going to take this grid of images here as an example. So we have this unordered list and then a series of list items, which are going to be our siblings. And for the first one, I will give a class of peer. So this is now going to be the peer reference. And then I can come in my other 3 li elements, 1, 2, 3, and I will add a class. So the variant I will use here is peer-hover. So whenever the peer element is hovered, I want to change the opacity to 20%. And so now when I hover over my peer element, you can see that the elements that listens to the peer hover are losing the opacity, which is super cool. Quick side note here, this is just an example. I can imagine you might be tempted to replicate the same for the 4 images and have a peer class on all 4 images, so when you hover on this one, the other 3 would fade out like it is currently for this one. But unfortunately, that's not going to work because of the way the CSS selector is constructed here. You can see that we have peer hover, peer being this one, and then we have this general sibling combinator here. And the way this works, it's going to select any sibling element which comes after it. So in other words, this peer hover variant will listen to its nearest previous sibling. And if it finds more than one, it will only listen to the nearest one, the one that comes first above it. So if I add a peer class to the second image, you can see that for the first image, everything still works properly, but for the second, only these 2 are fading out. This image doesn't have a peer previous sibling in the markup. Same deal, if I add a peer to the third image, the first image will hide the other 3, the second one only the next 2, and the third one only the last one. So keep that in mind. Make sure that your sibling element with the peer class sits before the element that you want to use with the peer variant. Let me scroll down to this form here for another example. When I focus inside the text area, the placeholder is still showing, so the text hasn't changed. But as soon as the user stops typing, I loved, you can see that this now changes color. So we're reacting to the placeholder status and styling a sibling element, which is pretty cool. That's right, you can now use different colors for different borders in Tailwind CSS. And since we're in this form that has all the 4 borders gray, I thought that'd be interesting to actually highlight one border, maybe the top border. So here I have my input field, which is the first form field. And you can see that we have border gray 300. And so that's applied to all 4 borders. And here I'll just override the top border with border-t for top. And here now I can go with the color. So I'll go yellow 400. So let's do the same to the text area. We have border gray 300, and let's go border T yellow 400. And I think that makes the form quite interesting, and it still works with the yellow focus states. When I'm focused inside an element, the little cursor or caret is black, which is the default color. So let's go in both fields. We'll start with the input here and go Caret, and let's make it yellow 400 as well. And we'll do the same down here, Caret, yellow 400. And now, when I focus on my form fields, you should see that our caret is actually yellow. So if we look in our UI to our little info snapshot elements, you can see that the icons are slightly lighter than the text. And this is because they have a text color, but also a text opacity applied. In Tailwind, up to now, when you wanted to define a text opacity or border opacity or background opacity, you needed to use two classes. From version 2.2, Tailwind now has a shorthand syntax, which lets you define the color and the opacity in one go using the fraction or slash syntax. So slash 60 for 60%. And as you can see, it sets the RGBA color with the 60% opacity, and it still looks the same. So let's go and fix the other two. Instead of another class, I will just go slash 60. And so that works with text, but also borders and backgrounds. So if I come right at the bottom here of our UI, and you can see we have this nice button with a subtle border. So it has a border of yellow 400. And now I can add an opacity to make it even more subtle with slash 25. And as you can see, the opacity has been reduced. But now it surfaces another problem, which is the perfect segue for our next feature. All right, so as you can see, something does not look quite right with the borders here. And it started when I added the transparency. Let's actually make the border completely transparent. I'll even accentuate the contrast by changing these two yellow 300 values to yellow 600 values and making the border width 4 instead of 2. It looks like the color that should be at the end of the right is on the left, and the color that should be on the left is on the right. So let me make the border black and also border dashed. So it's going to illustrate what's happening here. So you can see that the border width is exactly matching our problem here. So it looks like our background gradient is defined inside the border instead of underneath the border. And there's a CSS property that lets us change that, the background origin property. So in Tailwind, you can use bg-origin. What we're going to need here is background origin border. And this is going to extend the background origin to go underneath the borders. And now you can see that the problem is gone away. So I can remove the border dashed and border black. And this time, if once again I add my 25% opacity to the button, you can see that there's no problems whatsoever with the position of the background gradient, which is now being applied underneath the borders with the bg origin border utility. Until now, if you wanted to apply transforms or filters or backdrop filters, you needed to use something that's called a toggle class, which essentially would enable the use of other transforms or filter or backdrop filters. For example, if we take this a quick and easy crowd favorite paragraph tag here, if I wanted to rotate this element, I would have to go first transform, and then I could go with minus rotate, let's go with 6. In Tailwind 2.2, you don't have to use that toggle anymore, so I can remove the transform class here, and this will still work properly. So same deal with filters and backdrop filters. If I wanted to add a backdrop filter of blur, I wouldn't need to use this backdrop filter class. I could directly go to backdrop blur, and let's go with small. And so let's add some transparency to our background. So our BG green 100 here, remember the new syntax, I can add a 60% opacity to it. And now we're going to be able to see through the image with the blur backdrop filter applied to this element. So let's look at this block quote here, and especially the best span here. And you can see that now is set to a text of yellow 500. Let's go and say we were using an arbitrary value of FFAA00 instead. So that works fine. Our color is applied because it generates a color utility. But what if I change this to a font size instead? I'm going to go with 3 rem. So now we've switched from a color utility to a font size utility. And you can see that the class generated is the font size. And that works because the just-in-time compiler is capable of evaluating what's passed in the arbitrary value and detect if it's a color or a font size and make the right decision. But what if we used instead a CSS variable? So here I'm going to go var, and I will use a -- surprise variable. We have no idea what is in the surprise, and neither does the just-in-time compiler. It doesn't receive the value, it receives the name of the variable and doesn't know what to do with it. So let's take a peek in our CSS file, and in there we'll find out that our surprise was actually a color. The just-in-time compiler still has no idea. So here, because it's a color and I know this, I will come here and prefix my value with a color column, which is somewhat a type hint for the compiler. It's going to say, hey, whatever is in there it's a color, so treat it as a color and generate a text color utility. And now if I save this, you will see that it now works. The appropriate utility class was set with color because we've told it explicitly. So now I'm going to come here and change this to 3rem. What's happening now is we're telling it to do it as a color, so it tries to set a color to 3rem, which doesn't work too well. So here, instead of color, we're going to use, did you guess it? Probably not, length. And check this out. Now it's going to generate a utility for the font size. So why length, I hear you ask very loudly from the other side of the world. Well, turns out that length is the actual name of the CSS data type, which represents a distance value. It's used for width, height, margin, padding, and, you may have guessed it, font size. All right, that's it for this tour of some of the new exciting features coming to Tailwind CSS in version 2.2. All of this plus much more is available right now if you install the latest version of Tailwind CSS. Go have some fun with it, play with it, and I hope you enjoy this release. And that about wraps it up for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.